Welcome to the Sacramentalists Podcast, a podcast where the ancient Christian faith is brought to bear on issues prevalent in modern culture. We're your hosts. I'm Father Creighton McElveen.
And I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And today, everybody, I want cheers from the audience. We have a new host joining us. His name is Father Hayden Butler. Father, welcome to the show.
We're really glad to be here, guys. Yeah, this is a dream come true.
That's what I like to hear. Yeah, Father Hayden, tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of where you are, where you're doing ministry.
Yeah, so I'm in Newport Beach, California. I'm the Associate Rector of St. Matthew's Church in the Diocese of the Holy Trinity of the Anglo-Catholic Church. I've been in ministry there for about 8 years now, about 9 years now. And for a good portion of that, I was also working bivocationally as a high school teacher, primarily teaching literature and theology. And I got to spend a good portion of that bivocational time founding a school in the town where our parish is situated called Pacifica Christian, which is a Christian liberal arts school at the secondary level. And so, I'm most of my ministry has been educational in nature and spending it working with students. But as of the last year and a half, I've been able to move into full-time parish ministry, and I've been enjoying that a lot, getting to focus there at the parish. So, and happy to be here.
Yeah, we are very excited for you to join us, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
We should tell the story too. We asked Father Hayden to be a host on the show. Gosh, it was probably about a year ago or so. And you couldn't because of some other commitments that you had. And then we were all at Synod recently. And I think I just jokingly said, well, Father, we're going to invite you on with increasing frequency so that you won't even notice that you're all of a sudden a host of the show. And it just kind of came up that, you had a little more freedom in your schedule and were able to do it. So it was a happy accident.
Yeah, it was great. Synod was great. It's great to hang out with everybody. And this is already one of the fruits of it. So, glory to God.
Amen.
Yeah, we didn't have to trick you or anything. Of your own free will.
At least not about that. Yeah.
Right. Well, awesome. Yeah, we're super excited to have you. And listeners, if you're on our Discord or if you're in the comment section on YouTube, do give Father Hayden a big welcome to the podcast. We're excited for the future. And you get to join for a pretty interesting episode. So today we are going to talk about the Cardinal Virtues. In the past few episodes, we've dealt with things like vices. We've looked specifically at acedia. We did a whole episode on that, which was really interesting. But today we're going to dive into the Cardinal Virtues. And so when we talked about vices, we also mentioned virtues and how the kind of pursuit of the Christian life is removing these negative habits. It's sort of removing vice and replacing it with virtue. And so we talked about the fact that vices aren't in themselves the same thing as mortal sin, but they can lead us into mortal sin. They're sort of the seed that propels us towards those actions. And so they form sort of a tree with branches. And we talked about that. And they kind of contribute to those negative patterns of behaviors. And so when we look at the cardinal virtues, what we're going to be looking at the virtues that sort of do the same thing, but in reverse. So they create positive patterns of behavior in our life. They lead us towards the fruit of the virtues, which is growth in holiness. So just as a quick recap, if you haven't been in maybe a catechism class or done any reading recently on the cardinal virtues, the cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So those are the cardinal virtues.
one thing I think to maybe add at the beginning of this too, and we highlighted this slightly when we talked about vices and how the vice isn't itself the mortal sin. The vice is kind of the ground of mortal sin. Is that the nice thing about thinking in terms of virtue ethics is it does shift you away from a sort of legalism or one size fits all approaches to what you should do, your positive obligations, and allows for wisdom to tailor the virtue to a particular context. And I think that that's a really helpful way of considering ethics. I mean, there are so many different situations we find ourselves in, so many gray areas. And so I'm a little skeptical of ethical approaches that have sort of one size fits all prescriptions. This allows us to say, okay, this situation might be a little different than that situation. And so our response will look a little different. And I just think that's kind of a refreshing way to consider our obligations.
I think that when we also are dealing with the virtue conversation is the stressing of the importance of habits and of habitual patterns, which again draws out a helpful dimension in discussions of goodness and of ethical behavior and ethical reasoning. By balancing it out, we sometimes think everything always we focus maybe too granularly on the moment or on a particular action. And we lose sight of, okay, what is the pattern that's being established here, and how is that forming me? And I think also with habits, we're talking about the unfolding of something within us, either something that is destructive within us, or the unfolding of something that is life-giving within us. And it comports, I think, more with the main scriptural metaphors of what ongoing formation looks like, as I'm sure we'll get to today, is like athletic training, as St. Paul says, or the horticultural parables that our Lord brings up about life in the kingdom. These have much to do with these patterns of thought and behavior and action over time, rather than the instantaneous, the short burst, the quick sprint. It's really setting us up for what does faithfulness, goodness, righteousness look like over the course of a very long period of time, and even a lifetime. And I think the virtues just have that already cooked into them.
Absolutely. And two, we talked about in our episode going over the 7 deadly sins, we looked at how there's a sense in which you can kind of reduce almost all of them to some level of like pride or idolatry, and you can see that they're all sort of intimately connected with each other. And they do form this sort of bedrock for our later actions. And so when we look at virtues, and we will, in an episode coming up, we'll look at the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. We'll see within those virtues that they do the same sort of thing. They act as sort of, it's not conceptual in the sense that it's sort of not there, but they act as sort of larger families for later action. And so it really is helpful, and I think important, to see the kind of necessity in creating these positive patterns of behavior. It's something we deal with as priests in the confessional, for instance. We're listening and we're sort of trying to find patterns in your life, trying to help you identify. It's what we should all be doing as Christians when we do self-examination, is trying to identify patterns of behaviors that then do lead us to sin. And so they make us, more susceptible to a given sin that could be grave in matter. And so I think it's something, Father Wes, like you said, it is sort of refreshing and sort of helpful to be able to see how these things inhere and interact in our lives. And I think that kind of leads us on to unpacking the name Cardinal Virtue itself. So it has nothing to do with a bird, maybe contrary to some people thinking it does. The word cardinal is really important because that comes from the Latin word cardo, which means hinge. So these virtues are the foundation on which all other virtues depend. This is the hinge point.
And I think you see this in art depicted a couple different ways. The first is that each of the cardinal virtues are often depicted as having daughters. So there's a kind of fruitfulness to these virtues. But then also the other image that's used is that of a tree. And so the cardinal virtues might be main branches, but then there are always smaller branches branching off of the main branches with other virtues that are under those cardinal virtues.
Yeah, it's sort of borne out.
I think you have, I think I seem to recall from like Frederick Harton, the great kind of spiritual writer of the early 20th century. He said that the cardinal virtues, are the backbone of Christian character. To highlight that centrality, he says that they're the point of articulation where the soul, the humanity of the soul should be united to the perfect humanity of Jesus Christ. And like that's, you can't say it in stronger terms than that, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think that also points us to the fact that this is sort of a deeply human reality. And so, like we've done in the past in some of our episodes, we're going to look at sort of classical antiquity in conversation with the biblical text and then later theology to see that pursuit of these virtues isn't strictly within the realm of Christianity, but that all human beings pursue these virtues, and we see them being praised and pursued in Greco-Roman philosophy is a great place to look at. You can see it in Hindu philosophy, you can see it in Buddhist philosophy, and so just as a point of some examples, we see in Plato, specifically in Plato's Republic, he mentions these specific virtues in book 4. And at certain points, he also will include piety as a virtue. A lot of antique writers will do the same. And so I think it's at least worth the conversation to include it in there. But Plato, speaking about the perfect city, the sort of ideal republic, states that in order for it to be well established, that is to say ideal, it must be known as wise, brave, sober, and just. And he extrapolates that as he explains it to the society itself. The people that make up the society, the citizens themselves, should embody the virtues of wisdom, of courage, of sobriety or temperance and justice. And that's a pretty clear example, I think, as Plato is sort of trying to understand what society needs to pursue in order for it to be considered good, and good in a ontological, metaphysical sense.
Good because it actualizes its telos, right? The purpose of the state can only be achieved with the character of those virtues, and that's only possible if the people have those virtues. So there is a sort of feedback loop there in terms of the culture or the state and the individual. It's if the people are like this, then the state will follow. But if the state is like this, then it's easier to have virtuous citizens.
Absolutely.
Something we don't know very much about today.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sort of political philosophy component here as it relates to good governance and a well-ordered society. But Plato's very clear that the kind of origin of the well-ordered society is the well-ordered individual, the soul. And that, from an institutional level, that sort of begins at a sort of grassroots. And this gets picked up and really fleshed out in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he argues that the goal of life itself is eudaimonia, which is sometimes translated as happiness, but I like flourishing better personally. But this good, this happiness, this flourishing, Aristotle says is a complete good. So it's desired for itself and not for the sake of anything else. It satisfies all desire, has no evil contained within it, and is a stable reality. And so for Aristotle, that means that human flourishing comes through acting according to reason. And the reason the human person acquires these virtues that help him actualize the goal, the telos, that eudaimonia, that flourishing. And so he specifically gets into, I think, which is really helpful, the idea that virtues are attained through habituation, that it is the use of these virtues, the replacement of virtue, of vice with virtue, that helps us to act virtuously and sort of grow in status as a rational, reasonable, good person. And so,
and it seems worth mentioning too, on that, with the notion of eudaimonia, is that we're again, virtue reorients us back in terms of moral thinking to a fullness, to highlight that kind of ontological sense you brought up earlier, Father West, the sense that there's a fullness of something that we can depart from in some way, and I think that in virtue is, again, not just that we have been found absent of vice, it is a fullness of a thing, and vice ends up being a departure from that fullness as well, the sum total of which being that thriving, that flourishing. And it's helpful, I think, reorienting again, like we highlighted at the beginning, that moral conversation away from, okay, to be a good boy is to not have done something naughty today, right? And I can, perhaps have not done anything naughty today, but still have not done anything good today. And those are not equivalent, and so, yeah, that idea that there's a fullness and end to the human life, it's significant to remember, because then it reorients everything around a something rather than the attainment of a nothing, or the absence of something.
And that actually, I think, highlights something very important. Cassian in the conferences talks about religious knowledge, and he has this sort of chart, and he divvies up religious knowledge into practical and theoretical components. But in the practical side, that aspect can be divided up into two smaller sections, one being a kind of self-awareness of sin and the means of correction. That is the purging away of something bad, the tilling of the ground, right? Getting rid of the weeds and making the soil at least neutral or favorable to plant something in. But then there is the discernment and order of the virtues as sort of the other component that corresponds to that. So in other words, there has to be a planting of something good. So it's not just the taking away of bad habits. You have to fill it with good things.
And also, too, the idea of filling sort of presupposes that the thing doing the filling is itself full, complete, and good. And so there's a real sort of substance to it. Whereas the vice, in a similar way to sin, there's a sort of negation, right? It's this absence. It's sort of ontologically suspect, because it doesn't have the same level of substance that the good has. And so when we replace, a vice, and we pick pride out and a vice goes in its place, what's being done is something substantive to the human soul that helps it actualize its purpose. Later on in the history of theology, someone like Aquinas will go into depth to talk about beatitude and the idea of pursuing beatitude, that it has a real metaphysical weight to it, and that sort of the spectrum of that pursuit, when you're further away from beatitude, there's this kind of sense of emptiness, of a lacking of a particular substance. And so I think Aristotle really does sort of start the process of really getting to this idea that virtues are substantive, and that the pursuit of those virtues is something that we should habituate. We should be doing habitually as habits, as patterns of behavior. And interestingly enough, he does sort of distinguish the idea of virtue and skill, which I think maybe in kind of modern philosophical discussions, you see this in sort of maybe the rise of some neo-Stoic thought, that virtue is thought of more of as a skill. It's more the sort of master craftsman kind of thing, where for Aristotle, a virtue isn't just concerned with the end result, but it's deeply concerned with the intention behind the action that may lead to a particular result. And so the skill is kind of more focused on the end product, whereas the habit of virtue is focused both on the good itself, the purpose, and the intention behind it, because you can sort of accidentally get to a good result. You can do something that's not so great, maybe kind of problematic, and then somehow good results from it. And that's not the same thing as a life spent pursuing virtue and really making that the pattern of your behavior. So I think also too, we should look at a biblical example, something very explicit. If you look in the Wisdom of Solomon, fantastic, one of my favorite pieces of wisdom literature, you can see in chapter 8, verse 7, again, very explicit. It says, if anyone loves righteousness, her labors are virtues, for she teaches self-control, prudence, justice, and courage. Nothing in life is more profitable for mortals than these. A really interesting thing that, we've got basically the sort of Greco-Roman philosophical tradition saying, hey, these are the 4 virtues we should all be pursuing. Then we have a biblical example that ties the pursuit of those virtues into the sort of pursuit of righteousness. And I think there's some interesting sort of nuance there. It's revelation adding something onto revelation. So there's sort of this natural revelation happening in the philosophical pursuit of virtue and goodness, the good, the true, the beautiful. And then we have biblical revelation saying, yes, that's all true and good. And then we have this new component of the pursuit of righteousness, the love of righteousness being added into that equation, which I think is actually pretty interesting. Because not only is it a sort of virtue that every human being can pursue, whether or not they're Christian, whether they've been baptized or not, these kind of cardinal virtues are incorporated in and form the bedrock of Christian virtue. So just because a virtuous pagan in the time of Plato exhibited courage or justice or temperance, there's also this idea that in the Christian life, those form the bedrock of our behavior, and they actually help propel us towards holiness. So it's not just goodness. It's not the pursuit of virtue to be quote unquote a good person, but there's also this idea that it's helping us to be better prepared and better and more receptive in a way to the working of the Holy Spirit in our lives, in growing in holiness and righteousness and a right relationship with God, which I think is interesting.
And it seems to be that's where the two meet. It was maybe within the domain of these virtues. To quote Harton again, he sort of he characterizes cardinal virtues as infused virtues, which I think a lot of Christians would probably kind of raise their eyebrows at, because typically we talk about infused virtues as just the theological virtues that we'll talk about next time, of faith, hope, and charity. And he says that ultimately, the 3 theological virtues can rightly direct, what is the excellences that are brought out in humanity through the development of the cardinal virtues to the end of beatitude. I think he's just kind of echoing Aquinas in that. But he's also he lays a heavy emphasis that the place where we should expect the formative influence of the Holy Spirit, who delivers to us these gifted virtues of faith, hope, and charity, that the place where we should expect the fruit of that gift to begin to emerge is probably in the ongoing formation and direction of our lives in these cardinal virtues. And so that's the place where we should expect to find them at work, and where we should expect to start seeing the effects of that grace at work in our lives. And so it's not despite them, as I think sometimes gets said, as, oh, well, now that we have, a Christian, a Christian understanding of things, now that we have, a kind of basic pneumatology, now we can dispense with, 1,000 years of, of classical moral reasoning. It's like, no, it doesn't seem to be the case. And I think, there's strong evidence to suggest that, that it retains a serious place in any Christian's life. And that there's a lot to learn still from it, even if it, even if it precedes the Christian tradition proper.
Well, there seems to be a relationship of codependency between cardinal and theological, insofar as the theological transfigure or elevate the cardinals, but the theological has to be expressed through something. I mean, faith, hope, and love are somewhat interior dispositions that have to be expressed somehow. And so how do you express that? Well, if I love someone or something, then then the cardinal virtues will be exertions of that love. And so it's very similar. I think if those are our dispositions towards God, then the cardinal virtues will be how we manifest that towards each other. In some ways, the summary of the law, I think, comes to flesh both of these out. If you love God, then you also love neighbor, and in loving neighbor, we love God.
Yeah, and I think I think that is like the perfect segue to take us into a discussion on the cardinal virtues themselves. And I when we were preparing this episode, my plan was kind of redirected through reading St. Augustine and how he defines these particular virtues. Now, there's about 1,000,001 ways you could go about defining these things. But I think in light of what we've been talking about, and sort of those two things meeting together, that the cardinal virtues kind of find their fullest expression in their relationship to the theological virtues, in the relationship to the life of grace that God gives us, Augustine's definitions begin to make a little bit more sense. And our first known encounter with cardinal virtues as such, as we talk about them under that name, comes from St. Ambrose in his commentary on the Gospel of Luke. But really, St. Augustine, kind of the student of St. Ambrose, right? St. Augustine is really kind of pushing this forward as he kind of dives into their particularities. So St. Augustine defines the virtues for us like this. He says, temperance is love giving itself entirely to that which is loved. Fortitude is love readily bearing all things for the sake of the loved object. Justice is love serving only the loved object, and therefore ruling rightly. Prudence is love distinguishing with sagacity between what hinders it and what helps it. Which I think at first blush, that's not how most people would have defined these virtues. But I think it's really important to kind of pick out what St. Augustine is doing, because I think it really gets to the heart of the kind of conversation.
Well, particularly because it orients it in that, it situates it in the exercise of love, right? Which is the foundation of the Christian ethic of to love God and to love one's neighbor, but also situates it in what I think is an especially Christian, ethical trait, which is it leads from a kind of what we might call an ascetical, out of the word ascesis, right? That kind of training oriented and metaphor for how we're formed in virtue, that is popular in the writings of St. Paul, especially this idea of, when a cause or a goal, an end has captivated your life, how is your life, radically reordered towards the attainment of that thing, to the attainment of that end. And if now we've received the gift of charity within our hearts that calls us forth and directs us to the end of beatitude, then what shape should we expect that to exert on the rest of our person? And then so I think Augustine's framing this in the terms of love that exerts a kind of, that exerts a gravity on some or other of our capacities. It's a very practical and helpful way of defining it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I think if we think about it in terms of love, it really does sort of reorient how we engage with these virtues. For instance, we'll start with temperance. I think if you ask someone on the street, maybe we'll add a segment where we ask people theological questions on the street, like Billy Eichner. Maybe we get him to do it. That would be a hoot. I think if you ask them what is temperance, they're probably going to say, I don't know, not drinking. So self-control to some extent, which is ultimately true. So, there is an aspect here when we talk about temperance where we talk about the control of self, abstinence, the moderation of appetites. But that's a very surface level understanding of what's actually going on at the heart of temperance. And if you look at history, right, we see the word temperance gets thrown around in a lot of cases, specifically maybe the temperance movement in history, in American history specifically, where, essentially the idea of the movement was to prevent people from drinking alcohol, right? There's this abuse of alcohol going on. And so the movement itself was this, we have to get rid of all alcohol, right? It's an abstinence movement, which is actually really unfortunate because that absolutely destroys the nature of temperance itself.
When we did I think it was our season on Anglo-Catholic devotion, we began with a discussion about the church calendar. And this is really helpful in terms of how Augustine frames it about giving oneself entirely to that which is love, because that is one of the purposes of the church calendar, is to teach us how to walk in such a way that our whole lives become oriented towards the object of our love, which is God. And we talked about how the church calendar oscillates between these seasons of feasting and fasting, because both are necessary. If we were only ever fasting and never feasting, then we would be ignoring some of the great things that God has given us. And if we were only feasting and never fasting, we would be gluttons who also couldn't really fully enjoy what God has given us. And so the church calendar walks us through this practice of temperance, directing us ultimately towards a greater good, that is the love of God.
Yeah, and I think too, we've talked about sort of ascetic disdain, and we've kind of gone through that. There's this sort of spectrum, right? You can either wholeheartedly and fully kind of accept something, or you can go the other extreme and hate it so much that you kind of pull yourself from it. Well, there's something that kind of that takes place here. The temperance movement itself is a deprivation, right? It's not actually being moderate.
Right.
It's not being balanced. It's saying this is a teetotaling movement. You have to get rid of alcohol completely. When temperance itself is this idea, it kind of has it as its aim the good of a person or a group of people. And because that's its aim, it balances the extremes, places you into this position of self-control or stability, which allows you the fullest amount of focus possible to pursue what is ultimately your good. Right? It's love giving itself entirely to that which is loved. You have to have focus. You have to have a sense of sacrifice and a fully given sense to pursue that good. And that requires self-control.
It restores to us, that this is an actual relationship that we have with God. And by couching it in some of the realistic terms that we would, I think employ in any other relationship we would call real. When we look at the temperance, for example, it's much more useful to ask, is there a point at which, or are there benchmark points along which I am progressively impeded in my ability to love? And that's a really fertile question that can yield some excellent self-knowledge, and also doesn't require us to do that kind of categorical ban necessarily. Not to say there aren't things that deserve a categorical ban, but in this case, it rightly identifies that people are different, and that there are different perhaps points at which love becomes impeded in them. But that sidesteps a lot of the immediate errors you can make in kind of creating a moral standard or establishing a moral rule for oneself or for a community. It's also, it keeps us away from, I think, what can be the inadvertent, interior byproduct of the opposite way of thinking, which is, oh man, what's the line at which, God is going to cut off my fun, and, I'm going to, so that I can go up to that, I can have fun to a certain point, and then after that, the fun's over. And I think that's a terrible way of relating to anybody, of saying, okay, this person has this line, and like once I cross it, they're really mad at me for having too much fun. And I need to stay on just this side of it, so that I stay, on just this edge of their good side. And instead asking, what is the point at which this relationship becomes inhibited or impeded? At what point can I not participate freely in this thing? That's much more productive. Yeah, and doesn't lead us to see goodness as the killjoy, the point at which joy is killed.
Yeah, and it prevents a sense of sort of gamesmanship, like moral gamesmanship, where it's like, oh, I can go up to this point in the line and we're all good. I go over it. Whoopsie, I've messed up. And it really kind of makes it a more like an experienced reality. It's something like in all of our lives, we know, like, I maybe shouldn't drink that much because it's going to impede, my activity or my focus as it relates to my spouse or to the project, whatever. We kind of intuitively know those things, but we also intuitively want the loophole. Like we want to make it a game where it's like, well, I know that's the line and I can take it right up and as close as possible to that line and, have all my fun.
That kind of gamesmanship really is inherently pagan, at least the way of thinking about it, right? I mean, we're conceiving of God as a sort of killjoy. If I have too much fun, then there's going to be a punishment to that, which is not right at all. Like he's Zeus or something, I mean, that's kind of the whole point of Greek mythology. As soon as you get built up to a certain point, the gods just love to tear you down. And so we have to avoid thinking about God like that. But also that whole view fails to actually be centered around the good, because the good is what brings us the most joy or the most happiness or the most flourishing. And so, I mean, you see this, I think, in Christian communities, like in dating, like how far can we go physically before it becomes problematic?
Oh man.
if you're having to, if at a certain point when you start playing that game, the whole thing is impure anyways, right? Even if you do stay within the bounds, there's still this kind of gratification that's going on that is unhealthy. And so the point is that these virtues teach us to reconsider what is good, what is our good. And it's not just a kind of cheap enjoyment, which is often, I think, what we gravitate towards.
And what is the good of the thing? What is it teaches us, again, we're relating also to God, to neighbor, but then also to creation, which I think is, again, that needful corrective to a kind of contemporary Christian, maybe just habit of seeing salvation and the work of the resurrection as being, restricted to just, the relationship between God and humanity, and forgetting, a la Romans 8, that this has a cosmic dimension to it, which implies, I think, a restoration of our relationships with that creation, right there. And temperance becomes a question of how do I exist in love, which means to acknowledge and to act in response to the best and highest good of this particular thing. And with some things, it's going to be, I should leave that alone. And with some things, it's I have limited interaction. With sometimes it's I can have a pretty robust interaction with this. It may be even seasonally, right? There's no point to that of temperance for imbibing poison dart frogs, but there might be a point of moderation for enjoying sourdough bread, or for enjoying malt, like for enjoying IPAs, and then those become questions we can ask. What is the the point of temperance in which my relationship to this part of God's creation is unimpeded, or is actually at a point of flourishing.
Pumpkin spice lattes. Seasonal.
Don't get me started. Don't get me started.
Not until after the feast of Christ the King, to give you an arbitrary rule.
That's that line.
That's the line.
Well, I think that, we can jump into the next one, which is fortitude. And, Augustine says, fortitude is love, readily bearing all things for the sake of the loved object. I think this one's really good. This is important because in a lot of conversations with the Cardinal Virtues, you also see this sometimes maybe listed as courage, which I think is a good word for this as well. There's certainly an aspect of courage that is required in bearing all things for the sake of the loved object. But there's this idea of the ability to sort of take on, to bear, to sacrifice for that which is loved, which also means that there's a steadfastness which defies pain and suffering and difficulty for the sake of the beloved. And I think we can also tease out the idea that there's patience and determined effort needed in the face of that discomfort. But I think it's also important to remember that fortitude isn't just, bloody-mindedness. It's not just, running at a wall saying, well, I'm just going to destroy this thing at all costs. But if you look at someone like Aristotle, when he talks about fortitude, there's this idea of like a reasoned resolve, a sense of a sort of rational, not stubborn, but a strength of will that helps us bear and persist in the face of maybe pain or suffering for the pursuit of the good, the true, the beautiful. And I think that's a really strong understanding of fortitude.
I'm getting ready to preach on the story this Sunday of Moses with the golden calf. And immediately after that is when he goes to God and basically says, take me instead of them, which I think is a great example of fortitude. It's that bearing of the burden of the sin of the people on their behalf to God out of love for them, which is quite a heroic act on Moses' part, given that he's just given them the law and they're, completely doing the opposite thing he just told them. I mean, most of us would just throw our hands up and say, I've had enough of you. But Moses goes all the way to the mat for the people out of his love for them. Love bears all things.
Yeah, I'm reminded too of the sort of how someone like Tolkien, for instance, when he writes a character, you look in The Lord of the Rings, sometimes people have issues with how the characters of The Lord of the Rings, like Aragorn, for instance, where's the internal struggle? Where's the hero that has like some bad, but, mostly good, and we get to see him struggle with it. And, he makes a bad mistake here or there, but ultimately comes through in the end, which isn't the point at all that Tolkien is trying to make, right? These are heroes. These are, Aragorn himself isn't 49% bad and 51% good, and it all tallies out in the end. He is good to his core, right? He bears burdens. I think he's a really good example of fortitude. Frodo is a really good example of fortitude in sticking with the task that is set in front of him, which is ultimately for the chiefest, the best good. And they don't waver. They're human beings. They suffer. They struggle. But Tolkien, in his providing of this sort of grand mythology, he's trying to teach virtue. He's trying to show you examples of complete sort of virtuous characterizations, not ambiguous characters, but wholly virtuous characters. And also too, when you look at bad evil characters, they're wholly evil, right? There's not like, oh, they're kind of good, and I kind of commiserate with the evil person that is the one who wants to kill and destroy everything. I kind of like him at the end. No, they're evil. Evil is evil. Maybe unlike some of the characters in maybe the Rings of Power series, which may be controversial.
That's a bonus episode at some point.
Yeah, well, we'll have to have like Father Damick on to talk about it or something, because that's his podcast. But I think it's really interesting to think about it in those terms.
With Fortitude, it reminds us that there's a recurring pattern in the scriptures of the test, of being tested, and that there's something that can only be revealed through testing, and overcoming. I think Bishop Scarlett pointed out in his synod sermon for the synod mass that he cited this the glory of overcoming, of enduring to the end, as the Lord says in his letters to the churches in Revelation, right? He who endures to the end, I will give the crown of life. And that I think that to circle back to your acedia podcast a couple weeks ago, this idea of, will I stay put when I don't feel like it anymore? Forget for a moment whether I'm being completely rocked by something actively, but let's just talk about that interior. I'm not feeling it anymore. So will I stay put and continue to honor my commitment, or to just sit in perplexity, and until that moment comes, there's something that is unrevealed in a person, and our character, whatever we can say of it, is kind of has an asterisk next to it. It's on probationary status until that thing is revealed. And so the person who hasn't been tested either by the aporia of a plateau season, or even just through active suffering, there's a question yet to ask about whether they'll stay put, something because that adversity hasn't forced virtue within them to take that shape yet.
Yeah, I like the idea of test, not in the sense of like some cosmic pass fail,
no,
but in the sense of like purgation, right? Of being purified, of being moved from one state to another, which isn't always a pleasurable experience as we would understand it.
And this happens to us all the time, and I think we don't even always fully appreciate it when it does. I mean, you have a stressful day, you come home and you lash out at someone in your family, and you might even say or think, I have no idea where that came from, because it was previously a veiled part of who you were, and then there has been a sort of apocalyptic unveiling, and now who you are is. And so then there's a cognitive dissonance sometimes between that story that we tell ourselves about ourselves and the reality that's happened. And so then what do we do? And that's where Fortitude, I think, comes into play. It can become very easy to become like Judas. I mean, that's one of the problems with Judas, I think, in the Gospels, is that once it's revealed to him, there's this cycle of a downward spiral that he can't get himself out of, because he doesn't really have that virtue of fortitude, among other things.
Yeah, Father Wes, you and I have talked about this at length, but the kind of idea that maybe this is the virtue that generationally we lack.
Millennials, yeah,
that we struggle with fortitude. I mean, I would be pretty willing to extend it to maybe the last 50 years, maybe the last 60 years or so, and say that kind of from a standpoint of a modern society, because of we have this massive illusion of choice and distraction and options and opportunity, that we sort of think we're pursuing some good. We think we're sticking to our beliefs or our convictions. But when you actually look at the sort of the particular actions along a sort of line, we're so inconsistent. We oscillate back and forth, and sometimes in some ways, those changes are out of our control. Socioeconomic forces may force us into working multiple jobs or changing careers or doing things like that, and those are real true things. But like the sort of variation in church attendance, or the lack of maybe sticking with a degree program or something like that, does put a light, the sort of interrogation into our actions and our motivations.
Where I've seen this the most at on the parish level is often with sort of millennial families who will say things, so that they'll come to a church, and maybe it's a smaller church, and they'll say things like, well, we like it here, we love the liturgy, and we love the theology, and we love the preaching, but there aren't enough young families. And it's like, well, there aren't enough young families because people like you come in and then they don't stay because there aren't enough young families. But if you just stuck it out for a couple months and the next young family comes and they see you, then of course, there's this kind of addition that can occur. So it's we sort of flitter about. I should say I did a Twitter poll and I asked which cardinal virtues do each of the generations lack. So I think for boomers, it was a lack of justice. For Gen X, it was a lack of temperance. For millennials, it was a lack of fortitude. And for Gen Z, it was a lack of prudence. So I guess these things come in cycles.
Just alienated our entire audience.
That's right. That's right.
Hey, everyone,
well, I guess that means I don't lack fortitude.
You lack virtues, audience. Sorry. Well, we all do.
I think
if they didn't lack virtues, they wouldn't need this podcast. So
that's it.
When we think about that in the mundane realities of parish life and community is, we constantly have to bear with one another and bear one another. In last week's, gospel lesson, right? The people who bore their friend to the feet of Jesus, right? There are real times when we do carry each other or are carried by someone. And I think that we sometimes think of that as a very costless thing. But it's again a repeating refrain through the New Testament of an exhortation to the churches to forbear with one another patiently in love, and it presupposes that you're gonna grate on each other. You're going to be painful to each other at times and burdensome to each other, maybe a lot of the time. And to think that, and again, it reorients our perspective of participation in the church from I'm here to have a pleasurable religious experience to I am here to find a place to reasonably commit that after the initial enthusiasm wanes, then I begin to be a Christian when things begin to be challenging to me, and I kind of want to do something else. And I think the church is one of the few places left that that has the equipment, has the stuff to call us to that and to give us a place to practice that. And because I don't see it a whole lot of places. Everywhere else is pretty, given to the customization and optimization cultures that say, oh, you don't like that, let's just adjust the UX on that, and version 2.0 will be better than this one, and the church, is one of the few places where we have the opportunity to be inconvenienced and annoyed, and actually bound to situations where forgiveness is required of us. And yeah, I don't know where else you learn fortitude except in a place like that.
If you don't love the church in front of you, you'll never love a church.
Right.
Which is hard, and it requires suffering and discomfort. But it's good. It's ultimately what we're supposed to do. So let's jump to the next one, which is justice. This is a fun one. Augustine says justice is love serving only the loved object, and therefore ruling rightly. I think, again, if we kind of took to the street and we asked people about justice, you'd get a pretty, maybe fairness, maybe something related to a legal system or political reality. And again, those are part of this understanding. But I think what's really important is that the word justice, when we look at its sort of Greek root, it has more to do with righteousness than it does any sort of understanding of maybe like fairness or government or a legal system. And so I also like to think of it as sort of moral goodness. And so if you sort of look at the sort of ancient Greek world and how it understood justice or righteousness, it's more understood within the context of a community or a society. So it's those sort of moral obligations that bind a society or a group of people together, and how those moral obligations relate to each other and how our actions impact them. And so when we look at Augustine's definition of love serving only the loved object, then we see that, when one acts justly, one is just, one acts in love towards the other for the good of the other. I remember talking to Bishop Chad when I was his curate, and we were just talking about love in general, having one of those like mid-afternoon conversations in the office that just goes into 2 hours of, theology and conversation. And we were talking about the kind of nature of love and agape, sort of divine love. And he said, one of the things he wanted people to understand was the fact that divine love is wanting the good for the other, which may mean that it's not what they want. Right? The good may be something that is challenging to you, but ultimately, we're here to pursue what is good for us, and sort of that kind of interplay, that interaction within the life of a community or a society, as it relates to what is good for the other person. That sort of connection is justice, in a sense, and how we realize that, how that binds us all together, and how it informs how we live in community is justice. So it facilitates the good within that network of relationships. So actions and behaviors that facilitate our ability to pursue that good.
I don't remember where, but I've heard justice defined as rendering the other their due, which I think is helpful, but it raises a couple questions like who's the other and what's their due, and do I do what I'm supposed to? Do I act on what's due them? But no matter who the other is, I mean, I guess you could point to someone like Anselm in terms of what we owe God. He certainly makes that argument, but I think in terms of other people, whatever our relationship to them is, it always is founded on the fact that they're an image bearer. And so what we do to them is never done in isolation, but it's always done ultimately directed toward God. And so it becomes, it reconfigures our understanding of justice, because you do get this kind of, and I think this is sort of an American Western individualist way of thinking, is sort of, what do I owe you? I mean, it's very much a reverberation of Cain's question, am I my brother's keeper? And I think a Christian understanding of justice says, yeah, we are.
Well, that gets to
That's
the
right.
idea of like obligation, right? Not what do I owe you, or like a right. I hate the conversation about rights, because we don't have rights. We have obligations to each other, right?
Rowan Williams gave a good lecture about engaging liberalism, and I thought it was a really excellent talk. And one of the things he did mention is that rights language, while sometimes flawed, can be really helpful, especially in a world that's gravitating towards different forms of despotism and tyranny. That rights rhetoric can actually be a way of insisting on the humanity of the other in a sort of radical way.
Sure.
It has a it has a tenuous, usefulness to it.
Yeah.
As a as a way station to something more profound. And we have to acknowledge that too. Justice is one of those ones where, I think, as we seem to be admonished repeatedly in the scriptures that our sense of justice is very tenuous, and we're cautioned in many places from summative, judgments on things and adjudicating things in a final way, not because such things are impossible, but because they might be presently unattainable for us, as we are, and so it puts it conditions our sense of justice, because, like you said, Father West, giving to the other their due, right? And well, what is their due, and who am I in relation to them? Those are ponderous questions, and so it teaches us. I would think a kind of, when I think the Western, in its best light, the Western, law tradition kind of errs on the side of we should be as cautious as possible, because we get this wrong so easily, right? We misidentify the good of the other, or we err in attempting to give the due to the other. In terms of rights, why it's unsatisfactory is that it stops and it settles for a very shallow vision of the human person that doesn't see them as this, ponderous likeness of God, that has an iconic quality that that reveals and is an epiphany in a way. And it settles for a very superficial set of things that are easily attainable, detectable, and quantifiable in order to constitute a person well enough that we can all get along with each other, which draws us back, Father Creighton, to your sort of conception of fairness. But then too, I think about justice in the sense of of the assertion of myself over others, right? And I just got done teaching at Hildegard College. We were reading the Eumenides by Aeschylus, and at the end of which is a trial of the tragic hero, and the Furies are wanting his blood for murdering his mother, and the gods have commanded him to do this, so he's appealing to them for divine help. And the question is this is a big mess. We have multiple overlapping senses of rightness here, and which one is to prevail here? And justice ends up becoming this kind of unsatisfying, concentration of vengeance, so that it doesn't fall too heavily on him, even though it's already haunted him within an inch of his life. And then we kind of end the play that way. And I think we think of justice that way as the the restraining of our ability to smother another or oppress another. And again, that's a very what do I want to say? That's a very crass and a very like awful and that's I would just say like an awful way of envisioning again this fullness, this thing that's meant to be a perception of what we really are and what the other really is. It settles for okay, how do we avoid oppressing each other as little as possible, which draws us back to the rights language.
Yeah, and it's easy to do this, right? Especially kind of post-Enlightenment political theory. We sort of understand doing as little harm as possible to your neighbor is the sum total of sort of our just action in the world. That's so unsatisfactory. That's so deeply flawed. When we understand the other A is a person, but that there's this quality, this pursuing of their good, of loving them so much as to pursue their good, which means I might sacrifice my own self, right? I might be called upon to exercise the virtue of fortitude in bearing a burden with them or helping them pursue their ultimate flourishing. And that sort of intricate network and of interwoven and complex relationships that make up a group of people in society, and how we act on them. It's a big question. I mean, I feel like we could probably just keep talking about justice for the rest of the night. It's so deep. It's a deep mine.
It would inevitably get us into some trouble too, I'm sure.
No doubt. It's us. Which, let's maybe some people would need to hear this, but let's talk about prudence as it relates to maybe people's actions on social media and other things. Prudence is love distinguishing with sagacity between what hinders it and what helps it. And I remember talking to a teacher in high school. We were talking about prudence. And I mean, basically, the way he talked about it was, can you distinguish between what is right and what is wrong? At a very basic level, can you determine your course of action? And if you can, then, towards your ultimate good, then you're exercising the virtue of prudence. And I think that's actually really interesting, because it's the sort of sense mechanism, the mechanism that St. Augustine that identifies, that's doing the distinguishing, is love, which I think is unique. It's interesting because we might say, like, oh, it's the person distinguishing between what helps it pursue its good and what hinders it in its pursuit of the good. But there is really this sort of substantive, almost, personification here of love doing the distinguishing, which I think is really cool. I don't know. That's a really lame way to talk about it, but it's cool.
No, I think that gets us, off to a great start, because, like Father West said earlier, we eventually have to do this. We have to actually live these things, and in real relationships that have a million factors to them, and to be able to parse between them. But yeah, these virtues have to be expressed in our lives actively, and so they can't remain theoretical to us. But I think that you're highlighting the problem there. Is on one level, in theory, prudence is very straightforward, right? It's, oh yeah, in any given situation, what best assists love, the ends of love, and yeah, great. We can go home. But then you get into some even very simple interaction with someone, and you already realize, like, whoa, I'm already up to my neck in different changing dynamic factors with this person, and what is the end of love worked out here with them. So it requires not just a kind of well-structured sense of these virtues, but also prudence. For me, it seems to draw us into the realm of what I might call like strategy or imagination, right? Which I think is an underappreciated faculty that we have is okay, how do these things get rendered in plausible scenarios first within me in my inward life, that then lead me to pick one and try to enact it in my outward life. And so this is that virtue that trains the plausibility generator of our soul, and then tells us, yeah, that's likely to work, or that's not likely to work. But it requires, it's more art than science, it seems, a lot of the time, of making on the ground decisions that sometimes we have to make very quickly. And it's very difficult. It's overwhelming, and you could see why maybe like Gen Z might suffer with this one, and struggle with this one, because I can't think of a generation that has had more information bombarding it than any other generation prior to it. And so if you were constantly had under a fire hose of information, yeah, imagine thinking of what is plausible, what is likely, what is prudent here. That'd be very difficult. That'd be more difficult than if you had fewer options.
The good news is we don't have any Gen Z listeners because our episodes are too long. We're not on TikTok or whatever. So we won't offend them. They're not listening.
We'll get some comments for that, no doubt.
But prudence is what prevents us from getting lost, right? Lost in the weeds. When the rubber meets the road and things get messy, prudence provides a through line still towards the objective that we have. It's knowing the means to the end. Interestingly, Aquinas ties prudence to the intellectual virtues as well, right? Wisdom, or knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. In other words, knowing the means to the end and how to get there in intellectual activity is also very important. So the telos, not only knowing the telos, but knowing the sort of tributaries one has to take in order to get to the head of the river is really important. This is why it's important also, if you're a layperson listening, to tell your pastor or priest why you want to meet with them ahead of time. Hey, can you talk? Versus, hey, can we sit down and chat about X, Y, or Z? Allows
Amen.
them to think about the purpose of the meeting so that they can steer you in the right direction better than if you spring it on them right then and there. It's a pet peeve of mine.
But it's a good shout because it needs to be said.
Well, like it's like Tolkien's, Tolkien writes, the difficulty of giving advice, right? Even the wise may err. And, even if for the sake of friendship, we would offer counsel to someone, it has to be conditioned with that of like, wow, it's an extraordinary ask. When someone says, what should I do with my life? We give as much help as possible.
Yeah. And I think there's an important aspect of discernment included in the action of prudence, in exercising the virtue of prudence. It's in a sense maybe one of the most complex of these virtues. Because on the surface, Father Hayden, like you said, this is the action one, right? This is the rubber meeting the road. This is the straightforward, hey, make the right decision. But if you tell someone, hey, make the right decision, that's huge. You have to know your purpose. You have to know what you're pointing to, which can be a massive undertaking. The amount of times that I've talked to people in a pastoral context where they're like, what am I supposed to do? I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know how to orient myself in this direction. I want to do these things. I know I should be better at this, this, and this. Or, man, I hate it because I act like a jerk and I do this, this, and this, and I don't want to do those things anymore. But, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. The sort of aimlessness that takes place in the human soul. That's a very real human experience. And so just the idea of knowing what the good is that you're aiming at can be difficult, let alone understanding what choices and what actions and what motivations are going to help or hinder you getting there. It takes a lot of discernment and a lot of self-knowledge, a lot of critical examination of the situation, time spent dealing with these issues. It's not quick. I mean, you don't have to be exhaustive. I mean, we're not limitless cosmic intelligences that can run an algorithm and figure out, this percentage of times I'm going to need to pick this or do that. But we can spend time with it. We can be still, and we can think critically, pray through particular decisions and situations so that we're as informed as we can be.
Also, prudence should probably be the most elastic of these cardinal virtues, I think, because especially from a pastoral perspective, life is so messy. And so what prudence looks like in one situation, one pastoral situation, it may look totally different than another pastoral situation. It's kind of that thing. I think it's one of the prayers that's prayed before you hear a confession, that you wouldn't be too harsh on those who are already kind of hard on themselves, but that you wouldn't be too lax on those who are too lax on themselves. It's being able to see people where they are, and sometimes progress for them may not look as dramatic as it does in other situations. It's small steps moving forward and in the right direction. But that takes a lot of wisdom, I think, to make those discernments, because once you get in the position of being a priest or a pastor, you realize most situations are not the ideal situations, and you're called to work with what's in front of you.
And we have to accept that there's going to be a degree of discomfort with that, and there has to be. The only way to avoid it is if we adopt, I think, what is a counterfeit of prudence and just say, it seems to work well enough. That's the kind of lazy and I think ultimately probably evil counterfeit of prudence, which just says it's good enough. It works well enough, and to be content with that. We have to again acknowledge the reality that our perspective is limited. It's not, we can't run every scenario exhaustively, but I think we should always feel the pressure of it, at the same time, especially in pastoral settings of, no, there is a true end of the human person. It is not just, whatever provisionally works well for the season and we'll reassess later. It's like, no, we are in our decisions that form habits, advancing towards beatitude or not. And that matters, this moment matters in that pattern of things too. And so that discomfort is warranted, even if at the same time we have to say, I may only be able to help direct you to a very local kind of, concern, right? To use the small steps language you use, Father Wes, of, prudence, maybe I can only see very short distance along the way here with you, or in my own life. And so, but even if it's a, embarrassingly near object, and if we're confident that it is on the road to beatitude, it's still okay to apprehend it, and to not try to go bounding through the darkness just for the sake of making leaps and bounds.
Yeah. And I think, by way of a sort of conclusion, it's interesting how these virtues react and interact with each other. Because in that conversation about pursuing maybe that small step towards your good, towards beatitude, in a lot of cases, that's going to require fortitude. There has to be some level of a willingness to bear that discomfort and maybe what feels like you're not actually progressing because you're taking one step at a time. But stick with it. Stay committed, stay focused on the good, let the love pursue that good, because that's ultimately, however small those steps are, half steps, quarter steps, whatever they are, you're progressing in the right direction. And so you're exercising prudence there, exercising fortitude. Maybe to get to that next step, you need to exhibit some level of moderation and self-control. You need to be temperate with your love. And so it's, to me, I think a really beautiful thing that we don't sort of, I think of something maybe like in D&D or something, or a role-playing game where you pick an attribute and you're like, well, I'm just going to pump my, skill points into that particular attribute, and I'm going to get really good at prudence. That's not how this works. What we're talking about really is integrated behavior. It's an integrated life. And so as we maybe, habituate prudence as a particular example, well, guess what? We're going to also grow in fortitude, and we're going to grow in justice and temperance as well. And it, that gives force, and it gives a sort of holistic sort of movement to the acquisition of virtue that I find both personally encouraging and extremely helpful in understanding how this life of pursuing virtue really builds on itself, and how, as Christians, as we'll cover in an upcoming episode on the theological virtues, how those virtues are incorporated into this matrix, and how we grow in faith and hope and love as we pursue. I think my mic cut out. So just pursuing God and sort of the life of grace as it was to the acquisition of these virtues. I just think it's a really beautiful thing. Any further thoughts? Final kind of thoughts to wrap things up?
I think it's great. Looking forward to theological virtues.
Yeah, I think it'll be a fun time. Well, listeners, I think that leads us to one of our favorite sections, and this is Father Hayden's first What We're Into.
Technically not his first. He was on the one time with Bishop Scarlett, so he had to do this one other time. But
his first time as a host. Yeah, as a host.
So no pressure, but it should be memorable.
So, Father Hayden, what are you into?
Right now, I am, enduring the tragic romance of being a Cowboys fan along with Father Wes. And, like all tragic romances, it has, points of, seeming felicity, and then, a catastrophe emerges. And it seems to be happening already for us. So at least we didn't get dragged along too far down the road this year. So, trying to see that with fortitude to the end, expecting to get my heart broken. But then other than that, I've been, we moved recently, and in our, my family and I, and in our new place, I discovered that unlike the photo that was on the website for it, a very aggressive English ivy had completely run feral through our backyard. And so I've been visiting the Day of the Lord on that progressively weekend by weekend, and clearing it out, only to find that underneath the feral ivy were a bunch of quickly concealed and chopped down stumps all throughout. So it's been stump day every Saturday for a while now, digging up stumps, which restores one to I think a sense of agrarian fantasy, but at the same time does get old after a while as new ones start popping up all over the place. So flexing the green thumb a little bit, and by green thumb I mean clearing the land so that my wife can plant pretty things in the backyard. So that's been occupying a lot of my time.
It's exactly that twofold motion we were talking about earlier. You're purging and she'll plant good things.
Exactly. She's virtue, I'm vice. I'm purgation, hopefully, at best.
That sounds like something my wife would say. I'm definitely vice, I think. But Father Wes, what are you into?
Well, two things. I think the first is I have to give a plug to Back to Virtue by Peter Kraft, which is a really helpful kind of primer on cardinal and theological virtues. So if this is a topic that you're unfamiliar with or something that you'd like to get into a little bit more, I would highly recommend that book to you. We went through it with some of the younger guys at the parish that I work at, and had some really interesting discussions about it. And I think Kraft is a great writer anyways, and so it's always worth reading things he's written. The other thing I'll say is teaching. So I've never stopped teaching. When we first started the podcast, I was full-time at a classical Christian school teaching Latin, and I loved it. But it just didn't work out to continue with that, and I went full-time at the parish that I'm at now in Maryland. My son just started school this year at a private classical Christian school about 5 minutes from our church. And I had previously been interested in subbing, but it just never quite worked out. And so I've been put on the sub roster this year and have gotten to teach quite a bit. And it's nice because they kind of know me and they know that I know what I'm talking about most of the time, as long as it's not Spanish. And so I've gotten to actually teach instead of just, do just only study hall type class periods or whatever. And so that's been really fun, just being in the classroom, building relationships with students, even if it's in a small role like a substitute. I still really, really enjoy it, and it's able to kind of scratch an itch that I always have of being in the classroom. So that's been a lot of fun. Father Creighton, what are you into these days?
Well, I'll join the club. I'll say two things. One, the serious thing. It was recently announced at Synod that I will be starting at a new parish in Atlanta called St. Hilda's. St. Hilda's in Inman Park. So if you're in the Atlanta area and you want to drop by, you're more than welcome. We'd love to have you. I'll be taking over at the parish the last Sunday of November. And so I'm in like full on pre-planning, trying to get everything together mode, which is really exciting and fun. But it's also a little bit nerve wracking, jumping into a new parish is always, has its joys and its difficulties. So very much looking forward to that. And that's taking up a good chunk of my free time and intellectual capacity. But the other thing that I'm into is, we've talked about this, I think, on the podcast before, but I like Halloween. I like a horror movie. I like sitting with candy and handing it out and all of the things that come with Halloween. So I've been on a bit of like a old horror movie kick. And so I was watching some Universal monster films, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, those sorts of things. Cheesy, but really great. The Mummy, all that stuff. Anything with, it always seems to fall out this way, but anything with Christopher Lee in it, he was just the king of kind of campy, cheesy horror movies of a particular time. And so I'm looking forward to watching my favorite horror movie, which is The Wicker Man, also with Christopher Lee in it. Father Wes, I think you're muted.
I was just about to say we should do a Sacramentalists Go to the Movies where we watch The Wicker Man, and then we should watch Midsommar and talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, those two movies have to be in conversation, I think,
yes.
Especially since Midsommar came out. But The Wicker Man is fantastic, strange, surreal.
And we're talking about the 1970s Wicker Man, not the Christopher Nolan, or not the Nicolas Cage Bees Wicker Man.
The bees, not the bees.
Not the bees.
Hey, he has an Academy Award, all right? Don't be knocking Nicky Cage.
Mind blowing.
It was for the Left Behind movie, right?
Oh boy, another podcast.
Yeah, The Wicker Man is fantastic. The Sacramentalists endorse it with 5 chalices out of 5. It's a fantastic film, and it's very strange and surreal and deeply religious.
It's a good Anglo-Catholic horror movie,
but also parental guidance. Just so you know, I have to put that out there.
We do not want to get emails.
Yeah, parents,
that you watched it with your kids.
Understand that it is an adult film and it does have some adult content. But yeah, those are kind of the things that I've been into.
You got to watch the Pooh Bear horror film.
The one you told me about, I know.
Yeah.
The fact that exists just is hilarious.
It's pretty weird, yeah.
It's millennials eating their own childhood at this point. It's great.
Oh, gosh, that's so true.
All because we lack fortitude.
Yep. It's really what it all comes down to.
The Pooh Bear horror movie exists because of our lack of fortitude.
Really, it's a commentary on the whole loss of that virtue.
Ooh. All right, listeners, if you like what we're doing, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter, like, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. And if you would, leave us a rating and review on iTunes. If you're interested, you can join the Communion of Patreon Saints for $5 a month. And that goes to help support this podcast and also gives you access to our Discord and a few interesting little bonuses every once in a while. And as it is Father Hayden's first time as host on the podcast, Father, will you pray for us as a closing?
I'd be glad to. Let us pray. O Almighty and all-knowing God, without beginning or end, who art the giver, preserver, and rewarder of all virtue, grant me to stand firm on the solid foundation of faith, be protected by the invincible shield of hope, and be adorned by the nuptial garment of charity. Grant me by justice to obey thee, by prudence to resist the crafts of the devil, by temperance to hold to moderation, by fortitude to bear adversity with patience. Grant that the goods that I have, I may share liberally with those who have not, and the good that I do not have, I may seek with humility from those who have. Grant that I may truly recognize the guilt of the evil I have done, and bear with equanimity the punishments I have deserved, that I may never lust after the goods of my neighbor, but always give thanks to thee for all thy good gifts. Plant in me, O Lord, all thy virtues, that in divine matters I may be devout, in human affairs wise, and in the proper needs of the flesh onerous to no one. And grant that I may never rush to do things hastily, nor balk to do things demanding, so that I neither yearn for things too soon, nor desert things before they are finished. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.